Okay, so it's just time for us to start. So I'm going to say hello to everybody. I'm Tessa Guttridge. I'm chair of the Young Dementia Network, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the Network Tea Time webinar today. This month we're focusing on working after a diagnosis of young onset dementia. And before I hand over to Louise and to Martin, who are going to facilitate the session for us today, using their experience, bringing their experience and insights to bear. I just want to let you know that all attendees are very welcome to use the chat and the question function, but can't be otherwise seen or heard. So just to remind you about that, but please do, we want to encourage you to use the chat and the questions. So I'm going to hand over now to Louise and to Martin, and I'm really looking forward to this session.
Thank you, Tessa. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Louise Ritchie. I work in the Alzheimer Scotland Centre for Policy and Practice at the University of the West of Scotland. So I'm coming today from Paisley in Scotland, and I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about the research that we've been doing over the last 8 years or so at UWS, looking at the experiences of people who have been diagnosed with dementia whilst they're in employment. Before we do that, I'm going to introduce you to Martin Robertson, who's here today to share his own experiences of working with dementia. So Martin, will I pass over to you and you can introduce yourself? Oh, you're on mute now, Martin.
Hi, sorry about that. I'm Martin. I live up above Aberdeen. And first of all, I must apologise for closing my eyes, but I've got posterior cortical atrophy, so I close my eyes to concentrate on everything else. I'm not rude of being asleep, honest. Right. First of all, picture this scene. I've been working at a dementia day centre all day, going out, just getting normally tired, go home, have my tea, get in a car, drive 35 miles to Hull Royal Infirmary for a 6:30 appointment to discuss what I've been having wrong with me, which was one-sided headaches. Obviously, I'm the last person to go in, so I leave it. I go into the consulting room, leaving an empty waiting room. The consultant sits me and my wife down and says, after all the barrage of tests we've done, blood, MRI, several MRIs, and other tests, there's nothing to see. However, for one last check, I would like you to do this test. Later, I find out it's called the Montreal Test. So we start, and I get some of the memory bits wrong, but I'm tired and yawning, so I don't think much about it. We then go on to the visual part, and I take time to get the clock right, and I take time about camels. But then I get told to, or asked to draw two infinity symbols chained together. So there I go, I start drawing, and I would swear to this day they were linked together. However, I brought my head up after drawing it, and I didn't have time to look before the consultant said, Mr. Robertson, I believe you've got frontotemporal dementia, and I advise you not to drive again. Have you any questions? So I looked down at I quickly glanced at the paper, and I noticed that the infinity symbols are actually separate edges of the paper, so there was no perception there at all. Obviously, I was a bit gobsmacked but so I went practical and said, oh, if I can't drive, it means I can't work. So can I have a sick note? And he said, no, you have to go to your GP for that. So we said, fair enough. And he said, are there any other questions? And we couldn't really think of any. So that was it. We walked out into an empty waiting room, no receptionist, and all the corridors of Hull Royal were empty anyway, being 7 o'clock by this time. But my wife being what she calls eminently practical, we started discussing, even at that point, powers of attorney and what to do and that's really big practical. So we discussed that. I automatically go to sit in the driving seat because I'd driven, but she told me off, obviously. So I got into the front seat and I literally jumped up and down. I don't know if all of you have seen Del Boy and Rodney when they get into their van and they jump up and down. It's a bit like that. I was jumping up and down. And she said, I know you're demented, but what are you doing? And I said, I'm free. He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I'm free of clock watching. I can do what I want, when I want, if I want. And I've had that attitude ever since. So we got home, and it took us a year to get everything sorted, and then we moved back up to our homeland, Scotland. And I started. I had to do all the work, looking for things to do. So we joined Alzheimer's, and then we found out about a trust that's closed, the Life Changes Trust, and I joined that. And my campaigning side came out again because in my misspent youth, I got chained to bulldozers, and I was never arrested, but obviously the police were not very happy about all this. So I brought my campaigning hat on again. I'm too old for that kind of caper now. But so I started giving speeches here, there, and everywhere. And then this was August, September 2019. I knew the winter was coming in, and up here they're long and dark. So I wondered what I could do. And by this time, I realized that not everyone had the same attitude as me towards work, shall we say, or paid work. So I wrote to Life Changes Trust, and they actually paid for me to get a laptop and bits and bobs, and the lap paid for access for me to get to databases so I could write this book, Work After a Dementia Diagnosis. And I used some academic papers, and I used some, I suppose, autobiographies, Wendy Mitchell's first book, and A Slow Puncher I used, and another book I can't remember, because they were all showing how difficult it was for those individuals to come out of work. And obviously I needed to see that side. But one story that does stick in my mind, because obviously I'm up here in the Northeast where the oil is a big business. I remember reading, I think it was in Dr. Ritchie's academic paper, of a off-sea oil manager whose workers kept him right by signing his sign-off in his signature, thinking they were doing right because he was doing everything. He was doing things wrong, but they thought they were covering inverted commas for him. And he retired, and then they realized he might have dementia. So by the time his diagnosis of dementia came along, he was in the middle to late stages. So he didn't get what I would call a benefit of not spare time, but time like you do when you get diagnosed early. So in that sense, I'd say his workers were doing a disservice, because the earlier you get diagnosed, the more options you have. People see diagnosis as the end. I see it as an unexpected corner in the route of life. And probably because I'm Calvinist Protestant upbringing, but work to me does not necessarily mean paid work. It can mean very much volunteering of any sort and giving talks. But whilst I was researching my book, I found out of nowhere that I had the aptitude to actually read and take in, analyze, and write about academic papers. I'd never been able to do this before. So this is actually a new talent, if you like, I've got from dementia. But looking at it, I think it's because what I do is I close off my ears, not consciously, but I close them down. So I'm concentrating on one sense. And I can, this is My wife will tell you this, because if I'm reading a book, she'll have to tell me at least twice to get my attention, and then a third time to talk to me, because I switched everything else off. Right, but back to work. What I found was quite horrifying in many ways. To be honest, the larger the organization, like the NHS and local authorities, the quicker they were to get rid of you. I worked for a local authority, and they were quite happy to let me go. They weren't fighting to keep me. I'm not sure that was because they didn't want me. I don't know. I think they thought I was good at a job, but they just didn't see that there's a place for me. And it seemed to be the same as the NHS of all people. And obviously, small firms won't be able to make what's called reasonable adjustments. But the first problem is that, again, unlike me, many people with dementia find it hard to accept that they've got it, even after being told. So there's a period of, if you like, denial. I mean, it's like grief. You go through the periods, and the first period is denial. And to be honest, as I say, I never went through that. But once you've done that, people find it hard to tell their employers, because they do think that their employer will say, that's it, you're finished. However, there are plenty of human stories in my booklet that show that's not necessarily the case. There is a benefit called access to work. That's it, got it right this time. Access to work that the individual can claim for extra expenses involved in getting to work. One example would be if you work shifts and you had to use a bus, I couldn't do it anyway. I'd find that impossible. So the access to work paid for this man to get a taxi every day to and from work. And obviously your employer has to make what's called reasonable adjustments, but that will depend on the size of the employer, what they can do. To my amazement, disabled parking is not compulsory for an employer to put in, even when there is someone who's disabled. I goes back to that little gem that came out. But there are examples given of companies that helped by reducing time or allowing them to have more breaks. Sorry, I got an itchy nose. Allowing them to talk to their manager and that. And sorry, it's lost. Yeah, so there are reasonable adjustments that can be made, but many employers do still have the feeling that people with dementia have nothing to give, which then create, if that's the attitude the employee gets from his boss, or their boss, they will then go away and think that themselves, which is a kind of never-ending circle. But as I say, to me, it was just a new beginning, because, as I say, work is not necessarily paid work, it's work of the mind. And as I say, from out of nowhere, I'm really now busy doing a lot of co-research up in Scotland with academics at their level. And I use that research talking up here in Scotland, where we get access to civil servants. I've actually got to leave early because I've got a meeting with some at 3 o'clock. And the Minister for Social Care up in Scotland wants us to be involved. So that keeps those two sides keep me busy. And it's just to say that the earlier the diagnosis, the better, because you've got dementia, whether you've been diagnosed with it or not. I mean, you go into the room and you come out of the room with the same condition. So my main tip for those working in this area is to try and enable the person to accept the diagnosis as soon as they can, because then they get time to create memories with their family, do whatever is on their bucket list that they can do, things like that. So yeah, I think that'd be my main tip, would be to try, for the person with dementia, to try and come to terms with it as soon as they can, and for those around to enable them to do it, and not use negative terms like you can't work. You should say there is different work available. Not necessarily, you could say there's different work available, not necessarily paid. But then we come to the very thorny subject of state benefits. To my shame, I used to be a benefits fraud officer in the 1990s. So this actually worked against me, because until I got a formal diagnosis up here of PCA, I was a bit in limbo, and I kept being paranoid, thinking that that car parked there might have someone in it. Because I used to do that. I used to literally park outside people's homes, or not outside, down further up the road. So I know what they're capable of. So that worked against me in a sense. But the in-work benefit to claim is personal independence payment, which is care, the two components, carers and mobility. I found that to be easiest, actually, because the woman came out to the house and she actually gave me leading questions, to be honest. And I got full of both. That I got full mobility through my inability to plan a route and keep to a route. I walk my dog every day, but I literally use the same route every day. And if I had to go somewhere else, I would get confused. Mm-hmm. And the other benefit that you can claim if you're not working is employment support allowance. And that's either national insurance-based or contribution-based or income-based. And after 6 months, they see whether you go into what's called the support group, which is, I don't know why they call it that, because it's the very opposite. You don't get anything, you just get put in there and left. Or you do get support, and what they call support, to try and find work.
Mm-hmm. And did you do that, Martin? No, was that?
Sorry?
Did you apply for that benefit? Did you?
Yeah, I was going to come to that. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Luckily, I had enough national insurance contributions to claim, because once you're in support, if you haven't got the contributions based and you've got not much income, because the income rates are so low for benefits, you can't get anything. But luckily I had national insurance contributions, so I went for that. And that interview was, sorry about language, hell on earth. Within the first 5 minutes, my head was down and my wife was answering the questions. So it was pretty obvious I wasn't suitable. But again, I don't blame the worker as such, because the system makes you ask all 80 questions or however many questions there were. But as I say, obviously, I was out of it. But then I had to do a physical examination, and I was physically out of it. And she was trying to catch, but my brain was still there a wee bit, because she's again trying to catch me out. Because I said I couldn't do, if she gave me 3 instructions, I wouldn't be able to do them all. And lo and behold, she tried to give me 3 instructions, and I couldn't do them anyway. But I thought to myself, ding, she's trying to catch you out.
Yeah.
But the problem with claiming the benefits is they make you, the forms, you have to think of your darkest day, your worst day. And that's actually very hard to do emotionally, for both of you. And secondly, people don't like to put down their darkest day, but if you put down either your normal day or a good day, you won't get your benefit, basically. And another point is the forms, on the forms, the same question is often asked further down in the form, but in a different way. And people say, why is that? I've already answered that. That's deliberate, because I used to design forms.
Mhm.
And it's just to check that you're doing it
Yeah.
kind of, you're correct. I'm afraid that's pretty depressing to say that, but it's the truth. But I would say certainly is the earlier the diagnosis, the greater benefit to yourself as well as the wider society, because you can then do what you really want to do. I mean, even something like golf or whatever, that's still, it's not work, but it's, you're using your brain and things like that, but it's what you like doing. So yeah, I would say, if possible, try and get people people that you know diagnosed and to accept it earlier, as early as possible. Because obviously society at the moment thinks of dementia as people in a chair, in a lounge of residence home.
Yeah.
And one of my tasks is to try and change that. And I think we're getting there slowly.
Yeah.
And I think that's all I have to say.
Great, thank you, Martin. I know we're coming up to the time
Oh my
that you will
goodness.
have to go to join your other meeting. I wonder if anyone's got any questions for Martin just before we stop. Oh, there's a couple just coming in. I think one of the things that really struck me was, and I think Tessa picked this up in the chat, was your reaction to your diagnosis, and were you having a difficult time in your job in the day centre before you got your diagnosis?
Looking back, my driving was terrible, and I knew that. My perception was ridiculous. So, but I was driving to it, if you see me, I guess slowed right down and everything.
Yeah.
And the irony is, I was working in this dementia daycare centre, so I went in and I taught, at that time it was frontotemporal, and I hadn't even heard of that. So goodness knows what they would think about posterior cortical atrophy. As a local authority, you were only taught about Alzheimer's and vascular. That was the two dementias we were trained about. So you didn't know about any others. And looking back, the bosses were getting frustrated with me because obviously there was a lot of noise, and if they were trying to talk to me, I'd have to ask them to repeat it, and they were getting quite angry with me, so thinking I was not concentrating. So that will have been a sign as well. But which, if either side had known that it could be a sign of dementia, I could have been got at earlier, if you like.
Yeah.
But I didn't think I could carry on working because obviously I had people's lives in my hands. So I took them out for a walk or forgot their medicines. It'd be, yeah, I couldn't live with that. And it was the same with driving. I felt quite happy not driving because, again, I couldn't cope if I drove into someone by accident. So in that sense, yeah, I felt freer.
Your own kind of personal responsibility that you felt. Yeah. So just the comments that are coming in the chat are just saying thank you, Martin, for sharing your experience. You've such a positive outlook, which is lovely to hear. Great insight, and loving the quote, the unexpected corner in the route of life. That's been great. Francesca's asked a question. Did anyone in work tell you they had seen a difference in you before you got a diagnosis, and what did they say?
As I say, they didn't. The bosses noticed I was, in quotes, ignoring them when we were in a loud room. That was really about it, I think.
Yeah.
I think we had to write up case notes of us, and I think there was one case note that I noticed was a load of rubbish, and they were a bit worried about that. So yeah, I think the signs were beginning to be caught, but they'd certainly never heard of even frontotemporal.
Yeah. So.
And looking back, there's probably a person like myself in there, because if I went to that, probably any day centre as a client now, I wouldn't last long because they'd be too loud, too many colours, too bright. All it takes is for me to lie down for half an hour and I'm all right again. But obviously, you haven't got staff to sit with someone to do that.
Mhm.
And I would then show what's called challenging behaviour, because my needs weren't being met.
Yeah. Okay, so there's lots of questions that have just come into the chat now, Martin, and I know that you have to leave because that's 5 to 3 just now. Have you got time for one more?
Yep, sure.
Right, so the one, I'll just scroll back up because it's just, if this is from Louise, I think, not me, another Louise. If there was one message you could give to employers everywhere about supporting people affected by dementia, what would it be?
Don't use negative language. Either say, we're not able to afford it, but however, there are other opportunities for you out there.
Mhm.
Don't say that that's the end of your career, your life, your work. Now go and retire and have a happy retirement sort of thing. Don't say, yeah, just keep the positive language. And I would say, I use it mainly for research, but I'd use it also for all kind of work, actually. I would see all kinds of work as catnip. I call it catnip for the brain, because it keeps I want it, and it works, keeps the brain active. And if I haven't got something to do, I kind of get a bit of withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah.
But if there are any questions and you want to email them, I will reply.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's fine. I think that's a good idea then if we can do that. Thank you. And thank you so much for your time this afternoon,
Okay.
Martin. And I'll be in touch with you, and we'll
Right.
let you know how the rest of the webinar goes as well.
Good. Sorry.
Good luck with your meeting.
Yep. Right. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, thank you so much. Catherine, would you be able to share? Oh, you're already doing it.
There you go. There you go. Shared the presentation for you, Louise.
So yeah, I think that's been really useful to hear from Martin's perspective, and I think he's set up the presentation that I'm going to give really well. So can you give me the next slide there, please? Thanks. So what we're going to talk about this afternoon for the rest of the afternoon is look a bit more at the different experiences people have had working with dementia. We'll touch on the different employer perspectives, and then really taking the message that Martin was given there about even though you might end the job that you're doing, your career hasn't ended, and there's still lots of opportunities for people who are diagnosed with young onset dementia in terms of occupation, career and employability. So we'll end on that message around about rethinking employability. And I'll tell you a bit about the new project that we've just started that Martin's involved in with us. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is a kind of summary of the research that we've done to date at UWS and with various collaborators. We started off in 2013 with a grant that was funded by the Alzheimer Society, and I'll talk a bit more about the findings of that in a second. We then followed that up with a project that was funded by the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, and that was led by Professor Jill Stavert and Dr. Valerie, or Professor now, Valerie Egdale at Edinburgh Napier University, and we collaborated with them on that. We then had a dissemination grant that was funded by the Alzheimer Society, and again I'll talk about that a bit more later on in the presentation, but that was a grant to help us share the findings and trying to improve what was happening to people when they were diagnosed with dementia while still in employment. And then finally, as I said, I'll touch on this new project that we've just started, and again it's funded by the Alzheimer Society, and will be developing a resource or an intervention to support people who with young onset dementia who are in employment or want to be working in some form, and we're using careers guidance careers guidance approaches to do that. So can I have the next slide, please? So as I said, the first project that we carried out was in 2013, so 8 years ago. 9 years ago now, we started this project, and it was one of the first projects in the UK, at least, to look at the experiences of people who were diagnosed whilst they were in work. We carried out 17 case studies of people who'd had that experience, and it was a variety of experiences. The diagram on the slide gives a really basic summary of what happens to people. All of our participants first experienced the symptoms of dementia impacting on their work in some way, and it varied depending on the type of job that they do, the type of symptoms the person was experiencing, but they all had this period pre-diagnosis where they started to experience problems at work. Some were more serious than others, as Martin touched on. Some of our participants were working in high-risk occupations where they could make a mistake that could be life-threatening. Others were working in more office-based, where mistakes may just be missing a meeting or making a mistake on a system. And obviously the implications of making a mistake at work varies greatly between the type of job that you do. What then happened seemed to split into two. So people who were having problems at work tend to have high levels of stress as they deal with those problems without knowing why it was happening. So that ends up either them going to the doctors and getting a diagnosis, and as Martin said, early diagnosis and quick diagnosis was key to getting the support in the workplace. A lot of the people though ended up going off on sick leave, mainly citing stress at work, until they got their diagnosis of dementia in the end up. And that kind of distinction between that, how long that period of diagnosis was really important, because the longer the period goes without a diagnosis, the harder it is to get workplace support, and the longer a person's off sick, the less likely it is that they'll return to work, because things have changed, things have moved on, and the thought of going back to work at that point becomes such a huge thing. And as Martin said, some people are actually relieved to know that they don't have to continue in work. I hadn't heard anybody dancing in their car in the way Martin described it, but I think that's a really good conceptualisation of the amount of stress that people can be under when they're in work and struggling for reasons that they don't know why. So getting that diagnosis can be really sort of empowering to help them understand what's happening to them. Excuse me. The case studies we had then led on to this kind of period post-diagnosis where people could either, if they'd had support, they could continue working in their job. And we have some good examples of where people have been supported really, really well to work for sometimes years post-diagnosis. And that was all around about getting the right support at the right time and having a system to review that support. At points could be complicated and did involve sort of a multidisciplinary approach, but it did work successfully, and it gave positive outcomes for the individual, their family, and the people that they worked with as well. Other people who continued working found that period of being able to continue working helped them adjust to the diagnosis and then make that decision to retire. But that decision was theirs, and they felt they were positively supported to retire. The majority of people who were on sick leave, some, as I said, felt relieved that they had a diagnosis and they didn't want to go back to work, but others felt that they had been poorly treated in their work and that retirement was their only option. But they really felt strongly that had they had that diagnosis sooner, they could have continued working when before they had, if they'd had the opportunity, but it wasn't considered. So that is a really brief overview of what the findings of that first study were. Can I move on to the next slide? So one of the key things that we found in that first study was that the knowledge and the support of employees or employers to their employees was really varied, and where there had been some dementia awareness training, the outcomes tended to be better for the employee. So the next study that we did in collaboration with the University, Edinburgh Napier University, was to look at actually what were employers' knowledge and attitudes towards dementia in the workplace, and what policies and practices were in place to support employees when they were diagnosed with dementia. So we carried out a survey and then a follow-up with interviews with employers. And most of these employers didn't have experience supporting an employee with dementia, so it was a very sort of hypothetical, what would you do type approach. But these are some of the two key findings that I've highlighted in this. There is a paper published if you're interested in reading more about it. But in the survey, we'd asked them to respond if they agreed, disagreed, strongly, not strongly, to the statement, employees with dementia are not considered to be a concern for this organisation. And 45% of the respondents agreed. So that was the majority of, the more people agreed than disagreed. Quite a few people had said that they weren't sure. So at the time that we did this survey, sort of 2017-18, the people who responded didn't feel that dementia was a high priority concern for their organisation. We then, the other question was asking about the policies, and only 9% of the respondents agreed that they had a policy that would support an employee with dementia. So 91% of the organisations didn't have any policies in place to support employees with dementia. Now I know that that has started to change since 2017-18, but probably not to the extent that we're in a position that we could confidently say that if you were diagnosed with dementia, there would be a policy to support you in the organisation that you're working in right now. It's probably still less have a policy than don't. And this is just one of the quotes that came from this study that sort of highlights the approach that the employers had to dementia. So to my knowledge, there's not been a live example of dealing with dementia in the workplace, though that doesn't mean that of our employees we don't have people who have dementia. So they're admitting that it's not something that's ever been considered, and they wouldn't potentially even know if they've had an employee who's had dementia. So for example, all of those people who have left their workplace in the first study after being on sick leave and without having the opportunity to return to work, got their diagnosis, but not all of their organisations knew that was the outcome of their situation. So they might not even be aware that they've had an employee who had dementia. One of the other outcomes of this study was that the employers who had a kind of basic knowledge of dementia found that came from their own personal experience. So it was very much, as Martin was saying, they saw dementia as something that happens to an older person, and that the symptoms of dementia would be the sort of later stages symptoms. So they couldn't apply that knowledge to what might happen in the workplace. And they quite often made knee-jerk assumptions about what was the best thing for the individual, such as, well, if someone got dementia, then we would offer them early retirement, without really considering what the other options that might be for them within their role or within the organisation. Can I have the next slide, please, Catherine? So we have lots of support for our resources that are available to support people with dementia. The first one there is our dissemination project outcome. And that's published on our UWS website, and I can circulate the link for it. We developed that, there's 4 different versions of it. So there's a guide for employers, there's a guide for employees, there's a guide for HR professionals as well. So it's slightly tailored to the different roles and the different organisation or different perspectives that the person might have in there. We have Dementia UK and Alzheimer's UK have their own resources. And then the last one there, and again, we'll circulate this after the webinar today, is Martin's resource that he's developed on his own, which is available on the Life Changes Trust website as well to download, and is a really good read and a good summary of the research that's available as well. So we have some resources that are there to support people with dementia. Can I have the next slide? So this is the last piece of completed work that I'll talk about this afternoon. This is a study that we did. It was much more of a theoretical study. So we had found out what the experiences of people who are diagnosed in the workplace were. We had found out that there was potential to continue employment, but it wasn't always available and wasn't accessible to everybody. The situation's really variable depending on your own situation, your employment and the organisation that you're working for. We'd found out from the second study that employers didn't have a good awareness of dementia in the workplace and quite often thought they were making helpful and supportive decisions, but actually weren't really letting the individual have their say and facilitate them. So we looked at it from a sort of theoretical lens, and we looked at it from using a framework called sustainable employability, which is based on the capability approach. And again, this paper is available to read, and I think somebody's just asked if we'll circulate the reference list, and we will do that afterwards as well. But what we looked at was it looks at your ability to do, so it looks at your skills and your own personal resources, but it also looks at the situation that you're in and the skills that are the, sorry, that was the snack request coming in there. Yeah, so it looks at your own personal skills, but your employability is not just based on those personal skills. Your employability needs to be looked at in that situational aspect. So it looks at your material resources. So what are the things that you need to do your job? Do you have everything that you need? Martin's talked about the access to work. Do you need help to get to work? Are those things in place for you? And then also the physical and the social environment. So what are the basic setup of the building, or where do you need to work? But also what's the social aspect? So have you got supportive colleagues? Do colleagues understand what dementia is? Do they understand how dementia impacts on the employee, that person? And how does that all work together? So that was our last paper that was published on this area. So can I go to the next slide? So all of these things have led us to this point where we're at just now. So as Martin was talking about, he talks very strongly about he hasn't stopped working, his career has continued, and that Martin was doing his own work. We've been in touch with Martin over the last couple of years, but in parallel to that, we were having conversations with our careers guidance department at the university. So an academic called Emma Bolger, who works with us, as a lecturer in careers guidance. And I'll be honest, that my understanding of careers guidance has changed dramatically over the last two years or so. Career isn't about your next step on the career ladder, and it isn't about getting a better salary. Careers look at what you do and what occupies you and links it to your well-being, and it fits the whole concept of career fits really, really well with what we were doing and where we were about 2 years ago when we started working on this new project. because what we felt was that for lots of people, and particularly those who don't continue in the work or the job that they did, the only option kind of was retirement. And Martin's demonstrated today that that's not what happens. He does work in various ways, and he spoke about how he uses the skills that he had as a campaigner and activist in his younger years and what he's doing now. So we wanted to sort of take away that idea of this concept that your career is on ice and actually start to defrost it and look at how can we use the approaches that career guidance use to support people in various different situations in their life to develop their career, and start to apply it to people who are diagnosed with dementia and of working age. Excuse me, my voice is starting to go after talking for too long. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So our new project started in October last year, and it aims to co-produce and field test an innovative career guidance and development approach to support people living with dementia. And we're just at the very early stages of this, but we're hoping to work over the sort of last half of this year with a group of stakeholders that will include people who are living with dementia, family carers, organisations, career guidance professionals, and healthcare professionals, to work out actually how could this intervention work. And that will be things like looking at where does it take place, how would someone be referred into it, and what would be the content of that intervention that could be really helpful to support people with dementia, because it's looking at both people who want to continue in the job that they do and looking at the skills that they have and they use in their work and how they can be supported to maintain their employment and their employability to continue working post-diagnosis. But it's also aims to do what Martin's talking about, is if you're not able to continue working, how can a careers guidance professional support someone to look at the skills that they had and find opportunities for work and to develop and continue their career post-diagnosis in other ways. So we hope that by probably some point next year and some point in 2023, we'll have an intervention that will be ready to field test, and we'll be running that test in the north of England with the University of Northumbria, and in Scotland with coming from the University of the West of Scotland. So that is my sort of presentation of the research and the findings. I hope it complements Martin's experience and his sharing of his experience of work post-diagnosis as well. Now, if there's any questions, or if there's anybody wants to find out any more about the project that I was talking about, please get in touch with us as well.
Hi Louise, hi everyone. I was just in the background there, just coordinating the presentation. We have got a couple of questions, Louise. Okay. I know you haven't been able to keep an eye on.
No, I haven't.
So there was one question that came through from Martin, but I think you could probably give us your opinion as well. If there was one message you could give to employers everywhere about supporting people affected by dementia, what would it be?
It would be that people can still do. And it's about acknowledging that the diagnosis isn't the end of a career, and it's about being open to the possibilities, I think.
Yeah. And then just a question clarifying about Alzheimer Society. Is it UK or is there a different charity in Scotland?
So Alzheimer Society funds research across the UK. And I know Alzheimer Society is the care provider in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. They don't provide those services in Scotland. That's Alzheimer Scotland that does that, but the research arm of Alzheimer Society covers Scotland as well. So it is the same organisation as you know. That makes sense.
Yeah. So we did have a question about all of the resources you shared, and I just wanted to clarify to everyone that they will get a follow-up email in a couple of days and that will have a link to the recording of the webinar, and it will also have links to all of the resources that we've shared today. So we will add all of those in so that people can access all of those documents, including Martin's resource that he's written. So we'll have all of that in there. I'm just looking through the chat now. There is a few questions for Martin, which he is happy to answer after the webinar today, but he was very sorry to leave us, but he'd had a request to have a meeting with a minister in Scotland that he couldn't turn down. So it was unfortunate that these things coincided. So yeah, just having a look through.
So I just picked up, there's a point there from Zoe, I can't see your surname, Zoe, about self-employment. So the most difficult issue I find is when someone is self-employed and there are no physical difficulties. Actually, you've picked up something like two really important issues there. Self-employment is an issue, and we tried to recruit self-employed people in the first study particularly, and really struggled to get them. I think there's probably scope for a focused study on self-employment. I've heard some anecdotal stories of self-employed people who have made some mistakes and some lost their business because of dementia and the lack of support that was available for them. And I don't have the answers to it, unfortunately, but it is an area that hasn't had the attention that employment generally has had. And the other point that's always made there is around about the menopause, and that was something that came through in the first study as well, around the women having their symptoms being put down to menopause, which lengthened the diagnosis process and made the whole situation at work much more complex to handle for them. So again, another area that probably needs more research in it.
Yeah, I know that's definitely an area that a focus at the moment as well. Just two more questions have come through the Q&A from Louise Bates. Based on the research findings to date, what one change could employers make that would make the biggest impact for employees affected by dementia? It's a tricky one.
I'm not sure, and I don't know if we're even there yet with the research. I think what we're finding is the different sectors are also different in their approaches, and obviously the different types. I think the biggest thing is awareness, and somebody's mentioned in the chat about Dementia Friends sessions, and some basic dementia awareness can only help. So that if someone does disclose a diagnosis and feels more comfortable, or feels comfortable enough to disclose the diagnosis, that people understand what that means, and it isn't the older people in a residential care home. That's not what they're experiencing at that moment. So I would guess dementia awareness is probably
I think key for lots of people. And one more question here from Hilary. Do you think the leading dementia charities do enough to lead by example, employing people with dementia? And she says, thank you for your work, it's really interesting.
Thank you, Hilary. Probably not. I think it has improved over the last few years, and something I didn't mention actually that I should have mentioned in the slides when I was talking about this new project is that something that we're aspiring to do is employ people with dementia into paid roles through the project, and Martin's helping us and supporting us in how we develop that. But it's becoming more common, but it's not. And I think there's some work needing done, as Martin was talking about, the benefit system and how getting payment for different roles impacts on your benefits as well. So there's some complexities around about it that I think dementia charities should be advocating for, to allow the opportunities to be there as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, something we need to keep in mind. So I think that was all the questions, Louise. Lots of people saying thank you for all of your your information today. It's been really useful. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you everybody for attending.
Hi, so I'm popping up again to say that was really fascinating. It was so interesting to have the combination of personal experience from Martin And isn't it amazing that that new talent has come to the fore? That ability to focus and to be able to pull together the research and write, which wasn't felt to be part of the experience before. I find that really fascinating, that there is great potential to continue developing, and that's really good to hear. But that message around early diagnosis and then that giving greater choice, you know, once you've been able to access support, but so much also depends, doesn't it, on the employer and people's attitudes, colleagues' attitudes and such like. So I really thank you, Louise, for pulling this together, and in terms of your research, bringing us up to date on that. And I look forward to seeing you in 2024 with that new career guidance, because that's just going to be fascinating.
Yeah,
It's
we're so
really
excited about it.
Yeah, it really takes us forward,
Yeah.
doesn't it? Makes really positive progress. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending and for participating in the chat and the Q&A. As has been mentioned, there will be a follow-up email with all the links to the recording and the research papers and Martin's books as well. So next webinar I need to tell you about is the 18th of May, Wednesday, 18th of May, 2:30. And we're talking about connectivity through social media and through technology. And Catherine Talbot is going to be talking about that, along with Michael Andrews, who also has PCA. And he's going to be talking about how he accesses IT, how he uses it. So thank you for attending, and that's it for today. All the best to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.